After his loss yesterday, Magnus Carlsen was clearly keen to take the fight to his opponent. He had the white pieces. He was playing against the Azeri player Timur Radjabov. Now, Radjabov's favourite opening is the King's Indian defence. He's very experienced with it. But Carlsen took it on and played something a little bit unusual. Instead of playing the knight to f3, he's developed it to the g3 square. Now, one of the ideas behind this is to try and slow up Black's typical counterplay with f5. You can see, well, for a start, Black can't even play the knight out to h5. It's covered by this knight. And even if the knight retreats and the pawn comes to f5, then after exchanging, well, sometimes this knight might be able to get into h5. So it's an interesting system. It's not played very often, but clearly that was Carlsen's idea, to try to confuse Radjabov. But Radjabov played very classically, just playing in typical King's Indian fashion, putting the knight on this nice square on c5, securing it with the a5 pawn. Good strategy. Okay, now we can see one of the ideas behind White's system. It's the advance of the h-pawn. Well, if this goes a step further, then it's going to be very hard for Black to get any counterplay going with f5. And, you know, there are always some kind of threats to attack the king. So Radjabov blocked with h5. I think that's a very sound move. It also means to get anywhere, White will have to redeploy this knight and, you know, maybe later on hope for something like f3 and g4, but it's very slow. And in the meantime, Black does have counterplay on the other side of the board. But okay, it's a double-edged system. It's, you know, complex, and that's clearly what Carlsen wanted today. And, well, according to my database, Radjabov has never actually faced this system. So probably a good choice from Carlsen, at least in theory. Here, Carlsen castle queenside after about a minute's thought. And that's probably a mistake. It's just a bit too casual. He should play f3 first, which guards the g4 square. And only then, if he's going to castle queenside, then do it. And we have a complicated position. And yeah, I can imagine that, well, both sides will probably be happy with that. But Carlsen castled immediately. And he soon discovered what the problem was. The knight came to g4, attacking the pawn on f2, and however White defends that pawn, it's slightly awkward. So this is a nice move from Radjabov. So Carlsen cut the Gordian knot and just exchanged it off. Well, that saves time and sort of clears up the situation, and he has a solid pawn chain. But he's given up the two bishops. And although these bishops aren't really flying across the board for the moment, if the position ever opens, then they can really work. And this is one of the big themes of this game now. The problem for White is that to get anywhere here, you really need a pawn break. And where are White's pawn breaks? You know, you don't want to play f4. This will give the bishop a square. It opens up this bishop. It's very hard to push through the c5 when this knight is standing on c5. Of course, we would love to be able to play knight back and then g4, but be careful. You always have to reckon with Black advancing with f5. So Black has the more likely pawn break. So I think if anyone is better here, it could well be Black. At least it's Black who has the potential to seize the initiative. So already, you know, Carlsen realised he'd gone a little bit wrong here. But, you know, his position is still solid. He has a space advantage. So White isn't worse here. Sometimes, so Carlsen's brought the bishop back. Sometimes it can be useful to exchange this off depending on how Black plays. For example, Radjabov said after the game that he was actually considering b5, but thought twice about it, because here his queenside pawns would be completely shattered, and that would be too risky. Okay, so he played b6, rock solid. So that also means that sometimes, if necessary, he can recapture with the b pawn and keep this nice solid pawn chain. Okay, king b1, tidy move. Sometimes you can use the c1 square for a knight or a rook, and sometimes you want to play a3, so it just avoids some horrible tactic. King h7 from Radjabov. Well, it's almost a waiting move, actually. I mean, if white does exchange, then maybe we can get in bishop h6 afterwards. Queen c2. Pointing in the direction of black's king, but also with another idea in mind. If black hesitates again, then white can exchange on c5 and play a4, locking the queenside and preparing to play the knight into b5. And that's pretty annoying for black, hitting the c-pawn. Now black's probably not worse, but somehow it stabilises white's position. So I think Radjabov reacted well here. He played a4, so preventing that idea, and sometimes it can be nice to just prise open white's king position with a3. Carlsen came back. I mean, this knight is poorly placed on g3. So f5 came. This is the classic King's Indian move. And white has to be careful. The position is beginning to open up. Now, here Carlsen said afterwards that he took on f5 and he said, well, he was trying to be creative. If you want to play solidly, you could just drop the knight back to c1 and perhaps play round to d3. And, well, I don't think white is worse. But, black is also very comfortable here. You can see that after an exchange here, then his bishop could come to a nice square on g4. But, okay, it's probably roughly level. But Carlsen took on f5, breaking open the position. Very interesting. And now, as David Bronstein used to say, every Russian schoolboy knows you should recapture in such situations with the g-pawn, with the knight's pawn, in order to control as many squares as possible. And now the situation is beginning to open up for the bishops. Black would love to play f4 and to get the bishop to f5. But rook h3, and of course this is pinned. So now Carlsen is playing very creatively. I mean, this is, to be honest, this is slightly odd. So the king steps out of the way, so now f4 is a threat. But of course Carlsen blocks with f4. Now if black carelessly pushed on, well, this bishop is now running free, but white has serious counterplay here. He'd like to perhaps play the rook to h1, rook to g5, bishop d4. Well, this looks like good fun for white. But of course, black is never going to allow this pawn duo to be blockaded in such a way. Radjabov played knight e4, excellent move. Now, Carlsen can't live with this beautiful knight on e4. He exchanged it off and brought his rook to g3. Well, you can see the rook is attacked. So rook g3 and bishop g4. If white leaves this bishop on g4, then clearly he is struggling. This is a wonderful piece. This diagonal is opened. Well, there are going to be threats here. I mean, if white takes here, you can see that's a very powerful bishop pair. And there could be threats along the long diagonal too, not to mention opening up the position with b5. Disastrous for white. But this was never Carlsen's intention. He sacrificed the exchange. And here's the clever thing. Now, he wants to keep this bishop locked in, so he pushed with f5. Clever idea, clever positional sacrifice. And at this point, I thought that things were actually turning in Carlsen's favour. This bishop looks very poor. White's pieces are all very active, beautiful blockade. But Radjabov reacted very coolly. First of all, the queen defends the pawn on g4. Okay, now Carlsen was obviously worried about black playing a3, so he played a3 himself, giving the king some room. But now black finds counterplay. b5, excellent move. If this is exchanged, then it's all going to happen on the b file. And remember, here's a nice move, typical King's Indian. We can throw in an exchange sack with rook f4. Let's try to open this up. Very nice position for black. And actually black has the attack here, so understandably Carlsen wanted to keep the queen side as closed as possible, so he pushed on. Okay, this was taken. Another good decision. Again, bishop takes would allow the rook to come to f4, disturbing the queen, and then e4, and then the bishop flies across the board. So h5, interesting move. So Carlsen still maintains the blockade and is looking to disrupt the bishop. c4, good move from Radjabov. So he kind of greedily keeps this pawn, but it does mean, as we'll see later on, that if the position simplifies, then black has very nice pawns. But now Radjabov is running short of time, and this is such a tricky position. Carlsen would love to play knight h5, but then comes queen h7. Black needs to trade. So bishop c5 from Carlsen, hitting the rook. And rook f7 from black. Now, probably the best square. Very chunky move, actually. Queen h7 is no longer possible, but if white plays this, knight h5, then rook g8 is a good move. And black is actually very chunkily placed on the king side. You know, he's packing his king out. He's going to be all right there. But rook f1 from Carlsen. First, I thought this looked tremendous. I was analysing this move, queen g6, and suddenly it looks like black is under massive pressure. But Radjabov had calculated a fantastic variation. He can take this pawn, and after this, then he is the one to break through first. This is a forced variation. Now, white doesn't have a check here, doesn't have a winning check, but mate is threatened, and he is the one to break through first with this move, rook d8, and, well, white doesn't have a defence here. So Carlsen had to play the bishop back, so he's still looking to attack. After the game, he thought that he probably had, you know, he thought he had the advantage here, but he admitted he completely misjudged the situation because Radjabov starts to take control now. If he can trade rooks, again, black is making progress there. He's getting closer to an endgame. The queen is going to come and exchange or attack the king. So Carlsen shut that one out. And now another excellent move from Radjabov. He only had a couple of minutes left, but he was still playing these really, really critical moves. So, I mean, these involve a lot of calculation. So here, for example, pawn takes and then black trades queens. Good decision. And if d6, now the bishop no longer covers f8. So this move pins and wins. So now Carlsen is improvising. He's in big trouble. He played here. Still looks incredibly scary, but very coolly played from Radjabov. Bishop f4. Now the knight is attacked, and of course that knight defends the bishop. Carlsen could find nothing better than playing knight g7, and this allowed Radjabov to simplify into an endgame. And this was the last move of the time control. Radjabov still had a move to make, and well, he can actually save the piece by playing rook e7. and getting out of this pin. But his last move of the time control, made with just a few seconds to spare, was much stronger. Carlsen took the bishop, but now these two pawns are decisive. Basically, it takes too long for the knight to get back, too long for the king to come over, and Carlsen is utterly lost in this position. Well, let's just see the final few moves of the game. Radjabov just had to roll these pawns down the board. Now, needs the support of the king, but really there's nothing that white can do now. For example, king e2, then g3, and the g-pawn rolls home. Carlsen played this, but excellent move, rook f3, covering the g3 square, preventing knight d4 because of rook d3 check. And after this, the king came in, shielded by the rook, and then the king came around, and here Carlsen resigned. There's really nothing that can be done to prevent king f3 into g2, or well, yeah, there are other moves as well, king f3 and g2, depending on how white plays, but black is completely winning in that position. There we go. Well, that blows the tournament wide open. It's been years since Carlsen lost 2 in a row, and he looked completely shattered at the end of the game during the press conference. He said, you know, he's just looking forward to the free day tomorrow, where he'll regroup and try to strike back. But great game from Radjabov. Very well calculated when he was short of time. So that leaves the scores with Radjabov now sole leader with 3 points out of 5. Nakamura, Karyakin, Carlsen and Caruana all on 2.5, and Mamedyarov on 2, so he's fighting back. It's incredibly close. Anyone could win the tournament. Nakamura drew with Karyakin today. Very interesting game. And Mamedyarov won a very long game against Caruana, who, well, has come down to earth after his victory against Magnus yesterday. So it's wide open. We're at the halfway stage. Free day tomorrow. Do join me again for round 6 report the day after tomorrow.